Have you ever stopped to think about how two brothers, seemingly overshadowed by Joseph's grandeur, shaped the destiny of an entire nation? The story of Ephraim and Manasseh is a fascinating dive into a world of crossed blessings, unexpected choices, and a legacy that defies human logic. Isn't it amazing how God chooses the unlikely to accomplish the impossible? While many focus on the central figures of biblical stories, these two brothers emerge as a quiet force, carrying the faith and perseverance that still resonate today. But here's the question: what makes their story so unique? Why did Jacob decide to bless them in such an unusual way, crossing his hands and defying traditions? And how can their lives, marked by cultural and spiritual duality, teach practical lessons for today? Get ready to uncover a narrative that isn't just about the past, but about how culture and spirituality can coexist to shape our present and future. Because in the end, Ephraim and Manasseh are not just biblical characters, they are reflections of each of us. Joseph's journey is one of those biblical stories that captures the essence of faith and perseverance. Imagine being the favorite son, filled with dreams, yet sold into slavery by your own brothers. It seems like a cruel irony, doesn't it? But it's precisely in this that we see how God's promises shape every detail. Joseph didn't let. Suffering didn't define Joseph. He saw every adversity as an opportunity to grow. It's like when we face challenges at work or home. Can we turn those situations into stepping stones towards something greater? While in Egypt, Joseph could have drowned in self-pity. But instead, he thrived, even as a slave in Potiphar's house. Here's the practical lesson: wherever you are, give your best. Maybe you're in a job that isn't your dream or dealing with a tough situation. Why not use it as a training ground for excellence? Joseph shows us that when we're faithful in the little, we're prepared for much more. And what about the biblical stories of other patriarchs of Israel? They also point to this unchanging truth. But the prison. Who would have thought that prison would be Joseph's springboard to leadership? It seems absurd, but often it's in the most unlikely places that God's promises are fulfilled. In prison, Joseph interpreted dreams, a skill that seemed insignificant but connected him to the palace. Are we valuing the talents God has given us? Perhaps that skill you underestimate is the key to your next big opportunity. Joseph is proof that what seems small might actually be part of something grand. And then, out of nowhere, he's called to interpret Pharaoh's dream. One day he's in prison, and the next he's in the palace. It's as if the inspiring lessons of the Bible come to life. Life comes to life before our eyes. Joseph understood something crucial. Leadership isn't about position, but about service. When he became governor of Egypt, his priority was saving lives, including his own families. How often do we neglect our spiritual family or our duties in the name of personal success? Joseph reminds us that purpose will always outweigh status. Now think about this. Joseph, the rejected dreamer, became the preserver of biblical heritage. He not only saved Egypt from famine, but also ensured the survival of Israel's patriarchal lineage. His actions shaped generations, proving that culture and spirituality can coexist with practical responsibility. And in the end, his reconciliation with his brothers is a powerful reminder that faith and perseverance transform even the hardest hearts. But have you ever stopped to reflect on how this story directly connects Jacob's blessing to the futures of Ephraim and Manasseh? Ephraim and Manasseh are names that carry profound symbolic weight in biblical stories. Sons of Joseph, they were born during the most unexpected period of his life, the height of his power in Egypt. It is intriguing how even in foreign lands, far from their roots, they symbolize healing and new opportunities. Manasseh, whose name reflects the forgetting of past struggles, teaches something that seems simple but is so challenging: letting go of what is past. Hurt us. Think about how this applies to your own emotional battles. What do you still need to release to live fully? Ephraim, on the other hand, whose name celebrates fruitfulness in times of adversity, delivers an even more challenging message. He reminds us that blessings can arise even in the most barren grounds of life. How often do we feel paralyzed by challenges, forgetting that true strength comes from thriving not despite difficulties but because of them? Imagine a farmer who finds in infertile soil the incentive to innovate and discover more efficient planting methods. Ephraim embodies this resilience, showing that it is possible to grow where no one expects. When Joseph named his sons, he was doing more than making a paternal choice. He was declaring God's promises over his lineage. Ephraim and Manasseh were not just names, they were markers of divine faithfulness. And what about us? Are we speaking good things over our own stories? Perhaps it is time to name our Manassehs and Ephraims, not literally but symbolically, finding in our struggles and victories reasons to give thanks and move forward. These two brothers are more than historical figures. They are living reminders of the biblical heritage that spans generations. Manasseh, the firstborn, might have followed the natural path of leadership, but God had other plans, as we will see ahead. They remind us that the inspiring lessons of the Bible do not always follow the patterns we consider right. After all, how often does life surprise us, completely rearranging the order of what we expected? Their story already points to something greater, an unexpected twist sealed by Jacob's blessing. Ephraim and Manasseh invite us to reflect on the legacy we want to leave behind. If they, born amid Joseph's glory and challenges in Egypt, could become such profound symbols of culture and spirituality, what can we do with the opportunities we have today? Perhaps the real question is, are we ready for God to cross his hands and change our destinies, just as Jacob did when blessing these two brothers? Jacob's blessing over Ephraim and Manasseh is one of those biblical stories that seem to challenge everything we understand about tradition and order. Picture the scene: an elderly patriarch on the verge of death, summoning the strength to solemnly bless his grandsons. But by crossing his hands, Jacob defies expectations, giving the primacy to Ephraim, the younger, instead of Manasseh, the firstborn. This seemingly simple decision holds profound meaning about God's promises. Who said human norms define divine paths? This role reversal provokes a powerful reflection. How often do we cling to what seems logical and traditional, forgetting that God operates outside our patterns? Jacob, through this act, reminds us. His symbolic gesture reminds us that divine sovereignty is not constrained by the rules we create. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, where an opportunity you least expected emerged unexpectedly. Isn't it an encouraging reminder that God sees beyond what we can imagine? Interestingly, Joseph tried to intervene, attempting to correct his father. He believed the birthright should belong to Manasseh, following the logic of the time. But Jacob, with the confidence of one who walks in faith and perseverance, stood by his decision. What we learn here is that we often resist deviations from our plans, when in fact, they might be exactly what we need. Think about how the inspiring lessons of the Bible constantly show us that the unlikely is where God works most profoundly. Jacob was also passing on a legacy. He knew this blessing extended beyond the two boys before him. It pointed to the future of Israel's patriarchs. By crossing his hands, he demonstrated that God can rewrite any story, even those seemingly defined by hierarchy or chance. How about reflecting on the areas of your life where you feel the natural order is working against you? Perhaps it's in those very areas that God is preparing something extraordinary. But here's the mystery: Jacob's blessing doesn't conclude anything. It simply opens the path to something even greater. By highlighting Ephraim, he was pointing to, shedding light on the role both brothers would play in the biblical heritage, something that would echo for generations. Are we paying attention to gestures that can shape not only our present, but also the future of those who come after us? And as we ponder this, the next question arises: how does the cultural blend of Ephraim and Manasseh impact the meaning of this blessing? Ephraim and Manasseh embody a fascinating cultural tension in biblical stories. Born to an Egyptian mother and a Hebrew father, these two brothers carried within themselves the duality of the splendor of a superpower and the spirituality of the patriarchal lineage of Israel. It's like growing up between two worlds, each with its own expectations and values. This tension invites us to reflect. How do we balance our roots and our spiritual identity? How often does the culture around us challenge the essence of what we believe? Imagine the two boys walking through the streets of Egypt, surrounded by the grandeur of temples and monuments, yet guided by a father who consistently taught them about God's promises. Joseph, in his wisdom, knew he couldn't allow external influences to erase his children's biblical heritage. Similarly, today we face a comparable challenge. How can we uphold our spiritual values in a world that constantly pulls us in the opposite direction? A practical example might be cultivating daily habits like reading biblical passages or setting aside moments for prayer, even amid the busyness of life. This cultural blending also brought unique opportunities. Ephraim and Manasseh were not just heirs to Jacob's blessings, they also had access to Egypt's knowledge and resources. In his sovereignty, God often uses such combinations to accomplish greater purposes. It's like learning something new in an unexpected context and realizing it can be used for good. Perhaps a job or life experience that once seemed meaningless suddenly becomes a tool for God's divine plan in your life. But this duality didn't come without conflicts. As with any biblical story, challenges arise when two worlds collide. It would have been easy for Ephraim and Manasseh to fully embrace the Egyptian lifestyle, but they were called to something greater. This struggle between conformity and spiritual identity is something we all face at some point. Are we ready to swim against the tide when necessary? Their story invites us to seek a balance between culture and spirituality, without compromising what truly matters. As we ponder this, we can't ignore the impact this duality had on their role in Israel's future. Their mixed heritage shaped their perspectives and influence, preparing them to lead and become part of the 12 tribes. But the question remains, how did this fusion of cultures shape their journey, their position in the patriarchal history of Israel? And more importantly, what can we learn from this about finding our identity amidst the cultural pressures around us? The legacy of faith left by Ephraim and Manasseh is one of the most intriguing aspects of biblical stories. These brothers, deeply connected to Joseph in Egypt, carried more than just a name. They bore God's promises that would span generations. Think about how their biblical heritage intertwined with Jacob's blessings, forming a foundation for the continuity of Israel's tribes. What does this teach us? That a true legacy isn't built on material wealth, but on values that inspire generations. The combination of their cultural and spiritual roots made them symbols of unity and purpose. They show us that faith and perseverance can transform challenges into opportunities for growth. Isn't that precisely what we face today? Perhaps you're dealing with internal or external conflicts, trying to balance work, family, and spirituality. Why not start viewing these challenges as opportunities to shape a legacy that inspires those around you? Small daily actions, like sharing biblical stories with your children or engaging with a faith community, can be the beginning of something much greater. But the faith of Ephraim and Manasseh wasn't just about heritage, it was about choice. Every generation has the power to choose its path, decide how it will continue the story. These two brothers remind us that it doesn't matter where we begin, but how we respond to God's call. Perhaps the modern world tries to convince us that legacy is about personal achievements, but inspiring biblical lessons teach us otherwise. What truly matters are the marks we leave on others' lives, marks that reflect culture and spirituality. Ephraim, for instance, became one of Israel's most influential tribes, fulfilling the purpose revealed in Jacob's blessing. His impact echoed through history, demonstrating that obedience to God's promises brings fruit beyond imagination. Manasseh, on the other hand, reminds us that even those seemingly less favored by human order can be elevated by God's plan. Are we ready to accept that the legacy God wants to build through us may look nothing like what we imagine? The most fascinating part is that while Ephraim and Manasseh's story is specific, its meaning is universal. Their lives invite us all to reflect on what we will leave for future generations. How are we investing in faith, perseverance, and eternal values? Moreover, are we attuned to God's movements, even when they challenge our expectations? As we explore these questions, we can glimpse what happens when God's promises meet human choices, a dynamic that continues to shape lives even today. Story. It becomes clear that Ephraim and Manasseh are more than names in a genealogy. They are a living call to reflect on what we are building with our lives. What are you doing today that could echo through the next generations? How are you cultivating your faith and perseverance in the face of challenges? Perhaps it's time to reevaluate your choices, prioritize what truly matters, and leave a legacy that inspires and transforms. And more importantly, what actions can you take to align your life with God's promises? Think about this. Small daily steps can create an eternal impact. Start with something simple, a moment of prayer, reading biblical stories, or even sharing these lessons with someone you love. Never underestimate the power of a decision made in faith. If this story has spoken to your heart, don't hesitate to share what you've learned in the comments. How has faith shaped your decisions? And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep exploring these inspiring biblical lessons. Together, we can discover how eternal truths continue to shape our lives. World.